may be relatively poor. Marie Antoinette's famous alleged message to the hungry Parisians that in the absence of bread they should eat cakes represents a prototypical case of such failed communication based on the freezing on one's own pleasing perspective that all is basically well with the world, and the motivated reluctance to attune oneself to the audience's desperate conviction that things cannot go on in the business as usual manner. The case where one's own perspective is much more pleasing than that of one's interlocutor is, in fact, prototypical of severe conflicts of various types, on interpersonal, intergroup, or international levels, resulting in severe communication failures and misperceptions, cf. Jervis, 1976, Wurzburger, 1990. That may undermine the parties' capability to reach satisfactory resolution of their conflicts. The institution of third-party mediation, e.g., in marriage counseling, aims precisely at improving each party's ability to appreciate the other's perspective and hopefully increase their success in taking that perspective into account while designing their communications to the other party. To the contrary, if the communicator's perspective was much less pleasing to him or her than the interlocutor's perspective, he or she may rather readily alter her or his perspective to that of the interlocutor and adjust her or his messages accordingly. Research on Cognitive Tuning, Zerjonk, 1960, and The Communication Game, Higgins, McCann, and Fondacaro, 1982, indeed attest to communicators' tendencies to modify the communications to suit their audience's putative preferences. In this particular case, the communicator's initial perspective might be less pleasing or desirable to herself, himself than the audience's perspective, as adhering to the former might bring about a cool reaction from the audience. By the same token, adopting the audience's perspective is desirable or pleasing as its adoption promises a warm audience response that speakers typically desire. It appears then that the seizing and freezing tendencies prompted by the need for cognitive closure are not restricted to intrapersonal effects on social perception and cognition, but impact such important interpersonal phenomena as empathy and communication. As may be expected, these tendencies may often have a detrimental effect on our capacity to interact with others. They may diminish our ability to empathize with their lot and to appreciate their unique vantage point, hence reducing our ability to coordinate our own activities so as to ensure mutually advantageous outcomes. Interpersonal negotiations research described in what follows furnishes further intriguing evidence for this proposition. Interpersonal negotiations. Drew, Kuhl, and Oldersma, 1998, recently proposed that the uncertainty, ambiguity, and lack of definite knowledge that typically surround negotiations should be particularly aversive to negotiators with high versus low need for non-specific closure. Consequently, high need for closure negotiators may seize and freeze on any information that promises to reduce uncertainty. After reaching closure early in the negotiations, individuals high in the need for closure may refrain from considering seriously additional, potentially relevant, information that might undermine their subjective certainty. By contrast, low need for closure individuals should be bothered less by the uncertainty and hence remain open to further information and use it in contemplating their negotiation moves. Drew et al., 1998, conducted 3 separate experiments to investigate these notions. The first experiment investigated the negotiator's tendency to seize and freeze on focal points, Lax and Sabenius, 1986, Schelling, 1960, such as an initial strategy of reaching an agreement, Neal and Bazerman, 1991, or a norm based on prior negotiation outcomes. Participants in Study 1 acted as sellers who negotiated a price with a buyer. Some participants were told that previous participants in the study attained outcomes around 3,000 Dutch guilders, DFL, constituting a low focal point. Other participants were given a high focal point via information that the prior norm was around 11,000 DFL. Other participants were not given any information about a prior norm and hence were not provided with a focal point. Need for closure was assessed by means of a validated Dutch translation, Kratilis, 1995, of the original need for closure scale, Webster and Kruglansky, 1994. The negotiation task itself was presented to participants on computers. It was designed to represent the main characteristics of real-life negotiations by including multiple issues that differed in their utilities for the negotiators, providing them with information about their payoffs only, and retaining the offer, counter-offer structure of many negotiations. Pruitt, 1981. Participants were informed that their outcomes could be affected in three ways. 1. They could be lowered by longer delivery time because of the need to store the merchandise in costly warehouses. 2. They could be lowered by discounts given to the buyers, and they could be influenced by 3. Financing terms, e.g., cash, monthly payments, credit cards, etc. Participants were shown an issue chart listing 15 levels of possible agreements per issue with corresponding numbers representing the net profit value at each agreement level. In short, the participants faced a fairly complex and ambiguous negotiation situation. To increase their involvement in the study, they were informed that their final profits would be converted into lottery tickets for an attractive financial prize. The negotiations commenced with an offer from a buyer to which participants were prompted to make a counter-offer. This process continued for 6 rounds, following which the participants filled out a brief questionnaire. This study yielded several results of interest. First, prior to the negotiations, participants were asked what minimum amount of profit they would accept. This defined a limit the negotiators set for themselves. Northcraft and Neal, 1987, Ucal, 1974. As predicted, the focal points had stronger effects on limits for participants with high versus low need for closure. Thus, in the low focal point condition, negotiators with a high need for closure reported lower limits than negotiators with a low need for closure. By contrast, in the high focal point condition, negotiators with a high need for closure reported higher limits than negotiators with a low need for closure. Finally, in the absence of a focal point, there were no differences in limits as a function of the need for closure. Whereas limits refer to pre-negotiation effects, concessions refer to the actor's actual behavior during the course of the negotiations. Specifically, TEDTalks et al., 1998, measured concessions, operationally defined as the difference between the level of agreement, i.e., the profit for themselves. Participants asked for the 3 issues: delivery time, discount, financing terms, at round 1 of the negotiations, and the level of agreement demanded in the last round, round 6. It turned out that, overall, high need for closure negotiators made smaller concessions than low need for closure negotiators. Furthermore, for high need for closure participants, the high focal point led to smaller concessions than did the low focal point, whereas no similar differences due to focal point emerged for low need for closure negotiators. Finally, high versus low need for closure participants reported significantly less systematic information processing during negotiations. In their second study, TEDTalks et al., 1998, examined the degree to which seizing and freezing on social stereotypes about the other party may affect the initial strategy formed by the negotiators. In one condition, participants believed that the other party was a business student, whereas in another condition that it was a theology major. Based on prior findings, TEDTalks, Yazerbeet, and Lines, 1995, it was assumed that the business student will be viewed as more competitive than the theology major and invite a higher reciprocal competitiveness from the participants. That is exactly what was found. Whereas participants with a low need for closure were not influenced by the other party's group membership, those with a high need for closure made significantly smaller concessions when their opponent majored in business, rather than in theology. Furthermore, concessions made to the business major were significantly smaller when the participants had high rather than low need for closure. A critic might argue that the differences in concessions between persons high versus low in the need for closure were due to the inherently greater competitiveness of the former, versus the latter, participants. To investigate this possibility, TEDTalks et al., 1998, conducted a third study examining the relation between need for closure and social value orientation toward cooperation, individualism, and competition. Deutsch, 1973. Social value orientation was assessed using the Kuhlman and Marcello, 1975, decomposed game measure. Specifically, participants were presented with 9 decomposed games, in each of which they could choose from different distributions of outcomes to themselves and a hypothetical other person. Participants were given a choice among 3 alternatives, each representing one of the 3 social value-oriented tions being investigated. This work suggested that social value-oriented tone is not significantly related to the need for cognitive closure, arguing against the possibility that the differences in concessions observed in the Drew et al.'s 1998 prior studies were in part due to differences in social value orientation, but see Golek and Federico, 2003 reviewed later. The Drew et al.'s research also supports the notion that in negotiation contexts the need for closure evokes both the seizing and the freezing tendencies assumed by the present theory. The evidence for seizing relates to participants' tendency to anchor their initial limits in prior focal points, and the evidence for freezing relates to their subsequent tendency, manifest throughout the course of the negotiations, to offer smaller concessions as a function of prior cues, represented by focal points or stereotypes. The Drew and Kuhl, 1997, also obtained evidence that situational variations in the need for closure may importantly impact negotiations. Specifically, they lowered the need for closure via accountability instructions, cf. TEDTalk, 1992, or via increasing the cost of invalid judgments and decisions, that is, by arousing a fear of invalidity, Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, and found that these manipulations significantly lowered participants' tendency to use the consensus implies correctness heuristic, as well as to behave more competitively and to reach an impasse more often when a majority suggested a competitive strategy. In short, the need for closure seems to be highly relevant to the negotiation process. Neal and Bazerman, 1991, have stressed the detrimental effects of the use of heuristics on negotiations, and Fisher and et al., 1995, warned against the excessive focusing on one's own perspective via its mental rehearsal, and the barriers to listening and understanding the other party's communications this may foster. The research by the Drew and his associates, the Drew et al., 1998, the Drew and Kuhl, 1997, attests that such effects may be more likely under some conditions than others, specifically under conditions that may elevate the participants' need for non-specific closure. Specific closure effects. How might needs for specific closure affect negotiators' propensity to seize and freeze on focal points, stereotypes, or heuristics accessible early in the negotiation process? This should depend on the desirability to the negotiator of such cognitive cues. For instance, if the initial anchor represented considerable profit for the negotiator, hence constituting a highly desirable specific closure, his tendency to seize and freeze upon it should be greater than if the anchor represented a trivial profit. Similarly, if one felt strong dislike for the other party, one might be less likely to make concessions than if one felt a strong positive sentiment for that individual, e.g., in a dyadic situation such as a marriage. These ideas could be profitably explored in subsequent negotiation research, manipulating the desirability of focal points or the valence of sentiments felt by the negotiating parties toward one another. Conflict behavior. The very interpretation of a situation as conflictual may importantly determine the participants' subsequent moves in an interpersonal context. Bartal, Kruglanski, and Kla, 1989, Kruglanski, Bartal, and Kla, 1993. There is much evidence from real and simulated international and intergroup conflicts that in confrontational situations, where indecision might prove dangerous, intolerance for ambiguity increases, e.g., Singer, 1958, Stroifet and Fromkin, 1969. In such situations, the need for closure may well arise and reach considerable proportions, particularly where Native sources of this motivation, like fatigue, time pressure, etc., are also present and compound the effect. Labeling a situation as a conflict provides a clear-cut definition that dispels possible ambiguity. Such definition allows for well-defined responses and removes the need for further informational search, pushing the participants in a uniformly conflictual or competitive direction. As Rubin and Brown, 1975, have noted in their classic review of bargaining and negotiation research, when expectations are unclear, competitive behavior is likely to ensue, page 140. Similarly, there exists evidence that where the need for closure is lowered, the tendency toward competitiveness is reduced. This research has to do with the finding that increasing the incentives or stakes of bargaining increases cooperativeness. For a review, see Rubin and Brown, 1975, pp. 136 to 145. As Rubin and Brown summarized it, competitive behavior may be constrained by a reward structure which unambiguously increases the risk of loss associated with such behavior, page 144. That is, even if the competitive schema came first to mind, it might be abandoned if it was manifestly inferior in its consequences to the cooperative schema and if the participants were motivated or able enough to discover this fact. Admittedly, the relation between need for closure and behavior in conflict situations is not simple or straightforward. Rather, it should depend on what the most accessible course of action happened to be. Though the interpretation of the relationship as conflictual and the competitive mode of responding may often pop into mind quite readily, at other times cooperation or concession making may be the more accessible action schema. In such a case, increase in need for closure may lead to increased cooperativeness. Consistent with such an interpretation are the results of research on the relation between time pressure, known to induce the need for closure, cf. Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, and behavior in negotiation situations. Pruitt and Carnevale, 1993, comment specifically on this issue as follows: the basic effect of time pressure is to reduce the feasibility of inaction, and thus to heighten the urgency of taking action. Concession making is one form such action can take, contending is another, hence, time pressure can produce both reactions, p61. Specific closure effects. The conflict schema may be desirable because of its congruence with needs for specific closure as well. For instance, if the opponent is seen as different from oneself in her or his basic moral values and commitments. In this vein, Finlay, Holsti, and Fagan, 1967, attributed John Foster Dulles' beliefs about the existence of an insurmountable conflict with the Soviet Union to his Puritan ideology and commitment to Christian ethics. The Soviets' rejection of Christian principles, promotion of atheism, and the preaching of a new social order elevated the threat and danger that reinforced Dulles' conflictual interpretation of Soviet-American relations. Ronald Reagan's perception of the Soviet Union as an evil empire may have contributed, similarly, to his adherence to a conflict schema in thinking about relations with the USSR, and the religiously based rejection of the West by Islamic fundamentalists may well fuel their notion that the only way of dealing with its vestiges is via a holy war, i.e., an extreme form of competitiveness. The same appears true of George W. Bush's view of Saddam Hussein as evil incarnate. The desirability or undesirability of specific closures may also relate to the specific meanings attached to cooperation or compromise in a confrontational situation. A compromise on tangible rewards may not carry any particular stigma, whereas compromise on symbolic values may be highly undesirable and carry negative connotations. Along these lines, Gallo, 1968, argued that increasing the magnitude of tangible resources may often increase cooperativeness, possibly while increasing the fear of costly mistakes and, hence, lowering the need for non-specific closure, whereas increasing the magnitude of symbolic resources may decrease cooperativeness, possibly by increasing the desirability of the specific closure that one is a staunch defender of lofty moral principles. Research by Lee Ross and his colleagues, Ross, 1995, Stillinger, Eppelbaum, Keltner, and Ross, 1990, indicates that compromise proposals for bilateral concessions as well as the concessions that have actually been offered are often rated more negatively when they have been proposed by the other party in the negotiations, versus being put forward by an apparently neutral third party or the representative of one's own side. Along these lines, Stillinger et al., 1990, measured student responses to university plans concerning financial divestment from South Africa, which fell short of the students' own demands for divestment. Stillinger et al. Found that students' reactions to the plan were significantly more positive before the plan was actually proposed by the university than after this had occurred, that is, after it had become an object of a need for a specific closure to devaluate it. Research on negotiation by representatives, for a review, see Pruitt and Carnevale, 1993, pp. 56-58, is consistent with the notion that the desirability of toughness versus concession making may determine the negotiator's behavior in a bargaining situation. As may be expected, the negotiators are typically motivated to please their constituents. Often they seem to assume that a tough stance on their part will be viewed more favorably by those they were sent to represent than a conciliatory stance. Gruder, 1971, Walton and McCarthy, 1965. Indeed, the research shows that representatives tend to be less conciliatory and take more time to reach an agreement than negotiators who bargain on their own behalf. Benton, 1972, Benton and Druckmann, 1973, 1974, Druckmann, Solomon, and Zechmeister, 1972. This seems to be the case where no specific information about the constituents' preferences is available. However, when the representatives believe that their constituents are more interested in reaching an agreement than in winning, they tend to be more conciliatory than negotiators without a constituency. Benton and Druckmann, 1974, Teusvold, 1977. As the above discussion suggests, there seem to exist intriguing relations between needs for non-specific and specific closure and individuals' behavior in interpersonal, or intergroup, conflict situations, well worthy of further systematic study. The language of interpersonal discourse. If need for closure induces the tendency to seek permanent knowledge and avoid the recurrence of ambiguity, it should foster a bias toward general, trans-situationally stable knowledge. Accordingly, people under a heightened need for closure should prefer abstract descriptions and category labels over concrete, situationally specific depictions. Consistent with these assumptions, Mikulinsa, Yinan, and Kabili, 1991, found that persons with high versus low need for structure, an alternate term used to denote the need for closure, tended more to attribute failure to stable and global, hence, general and abstract, attributions as assessed by the Attributional Style Questionnaire, Seligman, Abramson, Semal, and von Baer, 1979. In the same research, high versus low need for structure individuals who worked on unsolvable problems were more likely to attribute failure to global causes and exhibited impaired performance on a subsequent task. In a different paradigm, Boudreau, Barron, and Oliver, 1992, asked participants to communicate their impressions of a target to an individual either more or less generally knowledgeable than themselves. Boudreau et al. Assumed that the task of communicating to a knowledge-able other would increase concerns about judgmental validity and lower the need for closure, whereas communication to a less knowledgeable other would reduce concerns about validity, thus enhancing the need for closure. Consistent with this expectation, their results revealed that participants expecting to communicate their impressions to an unknowledgeable other increased the preponderance of global trait labels in their descriptions, whereas participants expecting to communicate to a knowledgeable other used a lower proportion of global trait labels. Assuming the existence of such an abstraction bias under heightened need for closure, how might it affect the use of language in interpersonal discourse, and what effects might it have on interpersonal rapport? Rubini and Kruglansky, 1997, set out to investigate these issues in a question and answer paradigm. This particular paradigm simulates the situation wherein we acquire knowledge by formulating questions and directing them at others capable of providing informative answers. Recent work by Seaman, Rubini, and Fiedler, 1995, indicates that the abstractness level of questions influences the locus of causal origin for answers. Specifically, questions formulated with action verbs, e.g., to help, to write, cue the logical subject of a question as the causal origin of answers. Questions formulated with state verbs, e.g., to love or to like, cue the logical object of a question as the causal origin for answers. Thus, if asked such a simple and mundane question as, "Why do you own a dog?" using an interpretative action verb, persons are prompted to respond by referring to themselves, the subject of the question, as the causal agent in the answer. For example, by stating, "Because I enjoy the companionship that dogs provide." If one is asked, "Why do you like dogs?" however, one is prompted to respond by referring to the object itself, because dogs are good companions. One interesting implication of this effect is that individuals might feel that they disclose more about themselves when asked a question formulated with action verbs as opposed to inactive verbs, or more generally speaking, questions formulated at a lower, versus higher, level of abstractness. As a consequence, respondents asked questions at a low level of abstractness might feel closer and friendlier toward the interviewer, which may elicit reciprocal friendliness on his/her part. By contrast, respondents asked questions at a higher level of abstractness may feel more distant and less friendly toward the interviewer, again inviting a response in kind. Seaman, Rubini, and Fiedler also found that the abstractness level of the questions tends to be matched by the abstractness of the answers. Thus, the more abstractly formulated questions tend to elicit the more abstract answers. Such a drift toward abstraction might increase the felt interpersonal distance and feelings of estrangement in and of itself, apart from any possible effects due to implicit causality. After all, abstractness connotes generality and de-individuation, hence it may well depersonalize the interaction and render it more distant and less friendly. In their first experiment designed to investigate these issues, Rubini and Kruglansky, 1997, had participants under high versus low need for closure, operationalized via ambient noise, rank questions out of a list in terms of their likelihood of using them in a real interview. The list included 32 questions, 8 questions on each of 4 different topics. It was found that participants under noise versus no noise assigned higher ranks to questions characterized by a higher versus lower level of abstractness. In a follow-up study, questions selected by participants under high versus low need for closure were found to elicit more abstract answers from respondents, and ones focused more on the logical object versus subject of the question. Also, respondents reported feeling less friendliness toward the interviewer whose questions were more versus less abstract. Finally, in a third study, the results of the previous 2 experiments were replicated in a free interaction context. In that research, interviewers with high versus low need for closure asked more abstract questions, which in turn elicited more abstract answers, and ones focused more on the logical object versus subject of the question, and elicited less friendliness from the interviewee. These results suggest that the permanence tendency induced by the need for nonspecific closure may affect the level of linguistic abstractness, and in so doing may imbue the nascent social relations among conversation partners. Specific closure effects. The inclination toward linguistic or conceptual abstractness and its interpersonal consequences should be affected by needs for specific, as well as non-specific, closure. That should depend on whether, and to what degree, abstractness or concreteness was congruent with the desirable closure. Abstractness signifies that the characteristic in question transcends the specific situation and that it therefore implies generality, stability, or globality. If such a characteristic was desirable and pleasing, one might well want to perpetuate its applicability and hence manifest an abstraction bias. By contrast, if the characteristic in question was negative or undesirable, one might wish to minimize its implications and restrict them to the specific context by concretizing the way one thinks or talks about this particular feature. Research on the linguistic intergroup bias, lib. Maas and Arcuri, 1992. Maas and Stahlberg, 1993, Maas, Salvi, Arcuri, and Seaman, 1989, Maas, Milesi, Zabini, and Stahlberg, 1995, is consistent with these notions. The lib involves a tendency for individuals to describe positive in-group and negative out-group behaviors in relatively abstract terms, implying that the behavior is attributable internally to the actor's stable characteristics. Conversely, negative in-group and positive out-group behaviors are typically described in relatively concrete terms, implying situational specificity, and hence an external attribution of the behavior. One possible mechanism of the lib could be motivational, Maas and Stahlberg, 1993. Having to do with the fact that abstract descriptions of positive in-group behaviors and of negative out-group behaviors portray the former in favorable and the later in unfavorable terms. Similarly, concrete depictions of negative in-group behaviors minimize their significance as evidence for corresponding group characteristics, as do concrete depictions of positive out-group behaviors. In other words, those linguistic and conceptual tendencies serve to protect the perception that the in-group is superior to the out-group. I shall discuss the lib more fully in a subsequent chapter that deals with the intergroup implications of the needs for closure. Summary. Research findings described in this chapter suggest that the needs for cognitive closure, whether of the specific or non-specific variety, may importantly impact our interpersonal relations. To be intelligible, such relations require grounding in a common understanding, cf. Grice, 1975. The needs for closure may impact the arrival at such common understanding in various ways. The need for non-specific closure may prompt the seizing and freezing on one's own perspective and bring about failures to take the other's perspective into account. A need for a specific closure may promote either freezing or unfreezing depending on the relative subjective desirabilities of one's own and the other's perspectives. As we have seen, the seizing and freezing on own perspective or initial notions may impact a wide range of interpersonal behaviors including empathy, communication, and interpersonal negotiations. Seizing and freezing under a heightened need for closure may also foster a conflictual interpretation of one's relations with another because conflict represents a cut-and-dried, definite conception with clear behavioral implications. The tendency to adhere to a conflict schema may be further enhanced by needs for specific closure related to one's initial disparagement of, and condescension to, the other. The permanence tendency affected by the needs for closure may impact our interpersonal relations by inducing a tendency to think and communicate to others in abstract terms and broad categories. A person treated as a member of an abstract category, gender, professional, ethnic, or age-related for example, may feel that he or she is being pigeonholed rather than treated as a unique individual. This may induce a sense of interpersonal distance between people, reduce their readiness to self-disclosure, and forestall the development of intimacy and closeness.